This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, so we're live now. We'll give everyone about 5 minutes to file in, and then we'll get started at the top of the hour. See some people starting to file in, and just wanted to say welcome, and we'll get started right at the top of the hour, just giving everyone a little time to settle in. Hello, everybody. I'm going to wait a couple more minutes before we start the webinar. I just want to see people are starting to file in now. We've got 30 plus participants coming in. Just wanted to welcome everybody. My name's David Brown. I'll be hosting today's C45 event. We're going to wait just till a little over top of the hour until everyone's settled in, and then we'll get going. Okay, it is at the top of the hour now, so I think we're going to go ahead and get going, and people will continue to file in. Looks like we've got 40 plus participants now. So again, my name is David Brown. I manage a website called StratCan, and I'm hosting today's event for C45. The webinar today is going to be on what micro and craft growers need to know about quality assurance. and we've assembled a team here of different industry experts to share their perspective on that topic. I want to also thank both Velvet and Anuraga, who are in the chat today, who have helped organize this event, and they will both be monitoring the chat and the QA. Really encourage everyone to introduce yourself over in the chat. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your place in the industry. Are you an applicant? Are you a license holder? Are you just sort of a general stakeholder who's interested in the space and wants to learn more? We'll also be doing some Q&A with the audience at the end of our talk today. And so throughout the talk, if you have any questions, feel free to throw them up either in the chat or the QA function, and Velvet and Anuraga will be compiling those. And then at the end, we'll be addressing all of those questions. And sometimes people also like to jump in the chat and answer questions for each other. So keep monitoring that chat as we get going. And I will just start things off. So again, as I mentioned, my name's David Brown. This is a C45 event. We're going to have a handful of questions from our panelists for the next 35 minutes or so, and then we'll be opening up the floor to questions from our audience. I also want to note that we're recording this webinar, and we'll have it posted in the next week or so after the event. And again, I want to thank Anu and Velvet for helping me organize this, as well as thanks to the C45 board and its members. So as we know, any new cultivation license holder, be they micro or standard, will need to have a relationship with a processor in order to sell their product into provincial markets. The main reason we wanted to put this webinar together today was to provide these small scale cultivators, especially those who are just entering the market or just beginning to have crops ready for B2B sales, providing them with a better understanding of the finer details of those kinds of partnerships so as to avoid any missteps or unsold crops. So our panel assembled today includes several industry experts with experience working with this issue from different sides of the equation. We have Leslie Tomlenovich, the QAP at Indiva. They are a standard processor in Ontario who sells craft and micro-grown products through their Artisan brand in several of the provinces. We have Paul Brownfield, the QAP for Organocraft, a micro cultivator and micro processor in BC's Okanagan region. We have Nina Bernice, the QAP at Freedom Cannabis, a standard processor in Alberta, and Atia Farouz, a cannabis consultant and educator with several years' experience in the Canadian cannabis industry, and she is the founder and CEO of AgCan Consultancy. So welcome to our panelists today. And I'm just going to jump right in here. There are many factors that a cultivator looking for a partner with a processing license will need to consider before they even start their first crop. From liaising with provincial buyers, dealing with marketing and provincial recall insurance, to what labs to choose for analytical testing, how to take batch samples for testing and retention, whether or not to irradiate, and even what crops to select in the first place. So with all that said, I'm going to just give each of our panelists 5 minutes to give their thoughts on what some of the biggest mistakes a cultivator can make that can create challenges for them when it comes to selling their products to a processor. And so I'd like to start off with Leslie and her experience there at Indiva. So welcome, Leslie, and what are your thoughts on that?
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to have this opportunity. We do here at Indiva work with a lot of cannabis producers, and as was mentioned, we sell under our Artisan Batch as well as Indiva labels. Artisan Batch is a really special product that we like to work closely with growers to get really premium buds packaged in our jars. And what's really important is representative sampling. So we know what we're going to receive based on the C of A that's been provided to us, that those results are representative of the entire lot of dried cannabis. So it means samples collected from several places depending on how the lot is packaged on your end. So it could be something like you keep them dried in a barrel, you're collecting from the bottom, middle, and top of those barrels, and really being random in nature on how you select what buds are going to the lab for sampling. It can be really tempting to just pick those beautiful large buds that are hopefully the majority of that batch. But we all know that's not how cannabis grows. There's going to be smaller buds that will have a lower potency. So we really want to know the average of all those buds that make up that lot, because we know surprises are not fun on any side. So as the sales site, it's my responsibility to make sure that I can stand behind the results. And if that means that I have to do my own sampling when it comes in, depending on our relationship with the craft grower, if I have to sample and then my random nature of sampling comes up with an entirely different result, that's not fun, and it can lead to a lot of difficult conversations. We at Indiva really want to make sure that we're working closely on what we've learned from our own mistakes in the past. It could mean I go to the site and help them learn how to sample and create an SOP, or sample together, so that we only do have to do that one sampling of the lot, so that I can stand behind the results that we do get when time comes, not if, when time comes to talk to Health Canada about how the results were received. So was it based on sampling of right from the grower, or did we sample upon receipt? And certainly we know we pay a lot of money to labs, and if we can limit that exposure and that potential through a collaborative sampling, then that's a much better solution for everyone. Because Health Canada may sample our retentions at some point, and that could create questions on what the label potency actually is and what it's based on, or simply ask during an audit, what is the sampling of SOP to ensure that the labeled potency is in fact representative of the lot. So it's not just for potency, that's kind of the most glaring, but you know, if we have to resample for micro, if we do resample for micro, there may be surprises there, because bacteria is random in nature. We really need to make sure we feel confident in the results we get based on the entirety of the lot. The other just thing I'd love to mention based on what we receive from growers is understanding the bud sizes that we're going to receive. So
Leslie, you seem to have muted yourself.
Very strange. Sorry about that. I was just mentioning about bud sizes and knowing what is in the lot that we're going to receive. So some sorting really needs to occur. We've all seen the Reddit posts that, you know, the popcorn buds in a jar of premium product is not what consumers are looking for. So we need to know the percentage of those really nice buds. Obviously, more than 80% need to be those big buds, so that we know what we can commit to shipping to our customers. We need some small, certainly some small buds to make weight, but knowing what that percentage is before it's shipped to us is really helpful in getting that to market as quickly as possible.
Thanks, Leslie. And Nina, I'd like to pass it over to you now. I see you nodding to several of the points that Leslie brought up, but are there, you know, expanding on that, as well as any additional issues that you think cultivators need to be aware of?
Yeah, Leslie is very right. The representativeness of the sample is critical for determining the quality of the whole batch. So if the sample that is tested is not representative of the whole batch, it creates room for a whole lot of issues that both LPs have to address together. And sometimes the sending LP may think the receiving LP wants to shortchange them, but that's not the case, because potency, for example, is very variable in a whole batch. Like Leslie rightly said, the bigger bats have a higher potency than the smaller bats. So if only the bigger bats are tested, but the smaller bats are included in the batch, the result is not representative of the whole batch. To also add more information, the timing of testing is also very important for Health Canada. So the LP, the craft growers, the micro cultivators have to know what the intention of their product is. So what they are intending the product to be used for. So when they are sending the product to the standard LPs or processors, they have to know what they want to use the product for, and then determine when to test and what to test for in the cannabis during the testing cycle.
Thanks, Nina. Paul, so you're in kind of a unique position. There's not a lot of micro QAPs. Can you discuss maybe from your personal experience some of the lessons that you've learned up until now in terms of not only ensuring that your products are adhering to your own SOPs at your facility, but are you're coordinating with any outside processors that you're working with?
Yeah. In my experience, working with Shelters QAP, working with Shelters QAP originally, some of the challenges that we found were testing not making the cannabis potency testing not making a range for a listing, and having that come back from sort of the sales and management side of things, and kind of having we had to create a standard operating procedure to retest for potency, as we were basically 1% under the range of the listing, and as well out of spec for the trending data that we had for that specific cultivar. There's definitely a lot of challenges as well, in terms of when we first started, not having our analytical testing specifications nailed down, so that when we went to go and get our sales license, I had to rewrite the entire analytical specification sheet, which was a very, very good educational experience for me, being that I come from the food background and not from a science background. So that was a great experience for me to learn and understand. I know about the different pharmacologies, but to really understand each of the different tests and understand each of the different specifications and why each of the different specifications are there, and how to choose the best one relative to the product that you're putting out and the lab that you're working with as well. Also with CTLS tracking, it's a very complicated thing to do if you don't understand exactly how the glossary works for CTLS tracking, when it comes to the set of terms that your CTLS tracking use to describe your vegetative whole plants, as your flowering plants, the dried cannabis, the fresh cannabis, the flow, the product flow of how your cultivation plants go in and get processed into flowering plants, get processed into dried flower. When it comes to your specific process for drying, if you're hang drying or screen drying, or if you're wet trimming or dry trimming, it's going to drastically alter how your inputs and outputs come when it comes to that dried and fresh cannabis. I found it quite challenging at first to kind of nail that down, and then as well the tracking of it from month to month. It's going to depend on your seed to sale software and how your seed to sale software is set up, and what type of reports that you have outputting your data as to what you need to input for the CTLS. Luckily, I was able to work with Elevated Signals to help me to learn how exactly that data needs to be transcribed from your report output on your seed to sale software into the CTLS report, so that you're accurately reporting on your CTLS.
And Atia, just sort of as a overview, what do and in your experience, what are some of the missteps that new cultivators are making on their first crop or two, that is maybe causing some challenges for them when they're trying to find a B2B partner?
Yeah, there's quite a few. So one I wanted to touch on was definitely one that Leslie and Nina brought up, which is just, again, taking a representative sample, having a product specification for your popcorn bud and for your premium bud, and then sampling and testing according to that. Getting a C of A back for your premium bud should not be applied to your popcorn bud. Those are two different products, and they should be treated as such. Another great point that Daryl brought up in the chat is you need to select a good lab to work with. I'm not going to obviously delve into the lab names here, but I took a sample from a greenhouse producer, sent it to 2 different labs. One came back with the micro where I thought it should be for the quality of the producer and what I had seen internally. You know, we're looking at TPC over 200,000, looking at yeast and mold up in the 50, 60,000 range. And another lab, also certified by Health Canada, came back as not detected for everything. If I had sent that off to another producer and they had sent it to a lab and it came back with failure across all the micro, it would have been an immediate rejection. So be very careful when you're talking to a lab to look for one that is going to have their own procedure as well, that is also representative. Because if you send them a representative sample, and they're only selecting 1 or 2 buds out of it, you're really not getting the whole point of representative sampling, which is a nice homogenized sample. And to the micro as well, I know personally, I don't really agree with the fact that there isn't a like QA requirement really for micro cultivators, because there's so much to navigate if you're not very familiar with some of that more like biological stuff and how to set up your facility correctly and do, you know, cleaning validations and sanitation programs. So that's an area for sure that we see a lot of micro cultivators reaching out for assistance with. And it's because if your product doesn't pass for micro, you have to look at options of irradiation, e-beaming, potentially electromagnetic radio frequency, but it's quite a pricey option. Regardless, all of these are going to really rack up your costs, and micros are typically working in a very tight frame of profit margin. So there are things you can do throughout cultivation that are really going to put you in a good spot to make sure that your micro is coming in, you know, under what it's supposed to be. But it starts from the very beginning. It starts from how are you cleaning your plant, cleaning everything around your plants? How are you spacing out your plants? What's the airflow like, temperature, humidity? So there's quite a bit that starts off at the very beginning of the process. But I find it really funny that Health Canada says, well, only if you have a processing license do you have to have, you know, a QA person on staff. But I think that everyone can benefit from the beginning of the process, from clone all the way to dried flower. There are things throughout that process that, you know, a quality assurance perspective can be very helpful with to ensure you make the best quality product for your facility.
And Nina, I wanted to jump back over here to you. Last time we spoke, you were also kind of talking about some of the issues that you've seen in terms of cultivators even really understanding the testing results that they're getting. And can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's very true. And I know Paul mentioned that he took a significant time to put together the spec sheet, right? So that he can interpret the test results when they come in. So the foundation is understanding what Health Canada wants us to benchmark our results with. And it's from any of the pharmacopoeia that are listed in the Food and Drugs Regulation, the documents, right? So knowing the products that you are having, knowing the intended use, and being able to establish the specifications based on a selected pharmacopoeia is the first step. And then also knowing how to interpret the specifications in the pharmacopoeia is the next step. So when the results are received, when these basic steps are established and the results are received, interpretation is very straightforward. So for example, for yeast and molds, for USP, for example, it says not more than 2,000 CFU per gram. I know most LPs are writing not more than 1,000, but then there is a clause in the USP that says anything times any 100, 200,000 is multiplied by 2. So it's actually 2,000 CFU per gram. So when they receive the results, they are able to quickly reference it with the spec sheet and make the deductions that, okay, we are meeting our specs or we are not. Not knowing the right specifications is the biggest problem. So I encourage all LPs, if they have other buddy LPs, they can work together to establish the specifications and establish the specifications right from the beginning. And then it's an easy peasy thing to make the interpretations when they receive the test results.
Yeah, and you know, on the subject of analytical testing, I think another important point new license holders really need to be aware of is, you know, I feel like there's sort of a perfect storm right now where there has been a significant increase in license holders, and therefore the ability for Health Canada to inspect license holders is you know, very diminished compared to where we were pre-legalization. On top of that, we're 2+ years into a pandemic where we haven't had a lot of attention from Health Canada on this file and not a lot of inspections. and is specifically a lot of in-person inspections. There was a time when Health Canada was doing inspections on a very regular basis, usually unannounced, sometimes as often as once a month, and that really kept license holders on their toes. And I've certainly visited a lot of facilities in the last few years, talked with a lot of folks who have been licensed now for a couple years and have not had any kind of inspection in person or even virtual. And when it comes to selecting labs, there is certainly a drive to seek, especially in terms of potency, results that are going to appeal to provincial buyers. And I worry that there are a lot of license holders who aren't aware that ultimately, if there is some secondary batch sampling from a Health Canada inspector and it's found to not be compliant, out of the acceptable range, that could trigger a recall that could fall on your shoulders. It's not going to be the lab's responsibility in most cases. It's going to be the cultivators and or processors. So I think that's a really important point for a lot of license holders who are fairly new into this space. Is it's been very relaxed for the last few years. What we're hearing at C45 is that Health Canada is really kind of, and as well as from other license holders who are seeing these inspections, is that these inspections are starting to increase now. And there is a lot of calls from industry to have more scrutiny over more standardization of lab testing practices and results. And so I think people just really need to be aware of that, because a recall, especially for a small producer, for something as minor as your THC wasn't quite at the level that it was advertised as, or something as simple as a labeling error, can be a really big issue. And so taking the time also to talk to your processor and find out their thoughts on this. There's some processors who are going to have a very strict approach to this, and there are others who may be willing to kind of play the game a bit more. And you really need to kind of decide that need to be aware that just because people are getting away with it now, that's not necessarily going to be the standard. And I don't want to see any license holders running into that issue. And with that said, now, Leslie, I think and you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think it's important to note too that it's against the regulations to test until you get the result that you really want to see. So you can't just keep testing until that magic number comes up. So that's a really critical point, and one that needs to be repeated a lot, even to within the walls of our own organization, to sales that would like to always, well, can't you retest it? So to Paul's point earlier, specifications are really important to have established. I think in addition to that, the lab game is something that is really a reality. But we've done quite a bit of round sampling, and I really feel that the majority of the differences we're seeing in potency results are more attributed to sampling than they are to lab bias, just based on how we've done a lot of sampling and sent this, parts of the same sample to different labs. I'd say there's probably, sometimes it's a little different, which is frustrating from a point of view that there's not a lot of there is no standardization, which is frustrating for everyone. But what I've seen is a fairly, between 2 to 4% of lab bias at times, more of an average around 2. So it's not usually the glaring 10% that maybe people have seen occasionally. So I really think focusing on sampling, otherwise you'll drive yourself crazy trying to switch labs every couple of weeks on just to chase that magic potency.
Leslie, while we're speaking with you, I feel like you're in a position on this panel where you have a lot of experience dealing with a lot of micros and craft growers and helping them get products to market. And can you maybe give a few examples, obviously without naming any names, but of maybe a few kind of problem examples, as well as what an ideal candidate, if someone wants to develop a positive relationship with someone like Indiva for those types of sales, what are the red flags, as well as what are the the positive examples you're looking for?
Sure. Like, certainly some of the red flags will be really a lack of basic understanding of the requirements. And I don't mind, certainly it's in our best interest for the grower that we've partnered with to be as successful. It will ultimately lead to our mutual success, but there really needs to be a demonstration of a basic understanding of the regulations, potentially, and I recommend that the growers lean in with their service providers. So once you've found that lab you want to work with, lean into them and find out, what do you recommend, or, what's that package I should pick that'll get me all the required Health Canada sampling. Also from a sanitation perspective, lean in. If you have a sanitation provider, they should be helping you, especially if they're familiar with, you should be using somebody that's been in the cannabis space in a grow operation. And then lean into us as the sales end LP on how to, if there are questions. We've had some experience where, for example, a grower thought it would be best to make 7 small lots out of 1 lot that they were selling to us. Well, that creates massive amounts of testing. So understanding what is a lot, so there are some basics that really need to be understood. And if you need to reach out for some of those, really basic requirements before you're ready to sell into an LP, because it's a fast process, right? We want to get it, we want to bottle it, we want to ship it. So understanding all those basic requirements are really important.
And Paul, I just wanted to give you a chance. You had referenced some of those CTLS issues, and understanding how to navigate that process, and just hoping you can expand on that a little bit. What are anyone who's just licensed and they're just starting out? What are some of the pitfalls or issues that people need to be aware of right from the beginning in terms of record keeping?
Just to create, if your seed to sale software and their team doesn't properly educate you on the reporting outputs, it's important to create yourself a spreadsheet so that you can track the data from month to month on your own, to make sure that to make sure that everything is consistent from month to month, to know where you started and to know where you finished, and to take that data as well and cross-reference it against real inventory and real numbers, not just what's coming out of your CTLS, what's coming out of your seed to sale software, and just to stay on top of it.
I talked to a lot of different license holders who have a lot of different opinions on record keeping. Some say they can do it themselves. Some swear by certain third-party platforms. Without promoting or criticizing any specific platforms out there, do you have any thoughts on, especially if you're a very small micro, you're operating with a handful of employees, what's the most cost-effective approach to that, while at the same time ensuring you're doing everything you need?
Well, in my experience, which is limited to, kind of an archaic, basic seed to sale software that we started with, and then moving to Elevated Signals, which is more of a kind of an open canvas record keeping, build your own templates format. Elevated Signals is very, very good for the tracking end of things. I feel like even outside of that Health Canada and Canada Revenue Agency could do more for education for micros, and do more one-on-one webinars, do one-on-one sessions, educational videos, training, explanation of terms, publishing of the glossaries. Just help those who are just breaking into it, who really have no experience when it comes to this type of thing, to make sure that they're accurately reporting. As you complete each of those reports, you are declaring and you're signing off that everything is as accurate as, you're attesting that everything is completely accurate. And I know from my experience in the first few months of operation, just not fully understanding the ins and outs of both of those reports, that it really wasn't accurate, but we were just doing the best we can to get the reports in on time, make it match the previous month's data that went in, We had, multiple people here at the company trying to figure it out, trying to get the reports done. There was a few where, didn't track the data properly, made an error somewhere in the calculation. And then, when you go to enter in the next month and you have to enter your starting inventory, if you've made an error somewhere, you can't figure out what that starting inventory was, and it won't let you finish completing the report until you get that starting inventory amount, whatever it may be, plants or, dried or fresh cannabis. And also understanding what and where you need to destroy product throughout that process. For us, with a hang drying process, having all of the fresh cannabis go into the drying work order, and having the dried cannabis come out of come as an output from the drying work order, we had to destroy all of our cannabis that came out of that dry room as fresh cannabis, so that it didn't then alter the amount of dried cannabis that came out. And that's, that doesn't work with the logical process flow of, all of the fresh cannabis goes in, and then dried cannabis comes out, and then as well, all of the stuff that was on the floor or non-viable would be what you would think to be dried cannabis, but it's not. It's actually fresh cannabis and must be destroyed that way.
Atia, there's a recent change that Health Canada announced a few weeks back that they will be automatically issuing sales licenses to processors, both micro and standard. I was wondering if you can talk about that change a little bit, and what you think it means and what it doesn't mean for the industry, especially in the context of working, with other processors to get to market.
Yeah, so I think that when that was first announced, I saw a lot of micro cultivators posting that this had been a big holdback for them, right? So in the licensing process, many people went for the micro cultivation license, which would allow you to sell between cultivators. So you could sell to any other licensed producer, but you couldn't sell directly into the OCS, SQDC, or any of the other provincial distribution centers. Basically, you weren't allowed to sell anything that was for retail purpose. And so as a part of that, a lot of people who are micro cultivators have partnered with larger companies like Indiva and other companies that have a processing license that can help them get to market. Once you decide to apply for a processing license, there is still a sales amendment that happens after that. So you have to obtain that as well. So there was a waiting period between, if you're a micro cultivator, had your cultivation license for a while, decided to go for your processing license, there was still going to be a wait period between then applying for your sales amendment and a bit of a time loss there. So I think when this announcement came out, I saw a lot of micro cultivators really excited, because a few of them had said that, having that extra wait time for the sales amendment had been one of the reasons why they partnered with a processor or a larger LP to get their product to market. And a lot of them were intending to bring that in-house, which is fantastic because it does allow you to have more control over the process. But at the same time, there are a lot of extra challenges that come with selling a product direct to market and being sort of the only stopping point between the product getting into the consumer hands. I think a lot of micros have to remember that if Aurora is subject to a recall, you're subject to the same size of a recall and the same level. They're not going to go easier on you because you're a microprocessor and say, okay, well, it's okay that your potency is off a little bit, or it's okay that you have a labeling problem. And it can be very costly for you to take on that risk. So I know also as well that there is some basic qualification that needs to happen for QAPs for microprocessing licenses. But I mean, at the same time, if you have somebody who's your QAP or on your QA team that really isn't familiar with doing all these things, labeling especially is very difficult to do correctly. I even worked at a pretty big LP, the first LP that I worked at, we must have had like 6 recalls for labels in the first year. That costs money. We ship it all the way back. We strip all the labels off, we soak all the containers, take off the residue, put it back on. And then unfortunately, in some cases, excise labels got damaged as well, which are very costly to have to mark them down. So there are definitely some pros. There is, definitely having the ownership of the whole process, not having to pay. Some processors will charge you, or also like contract manufacturers, essentially, who white label products. They'll take your product in, package it for you and get it to store. So you do lose some, revenue there potentially, but you're also sharing the risk. If you're dealing with a larger company that's been doing this already for months, if not years, they've kind of got this down packed, and they also have software and systems and experience that you probably won't have off the bat. So if it's something that you don't feel you feel very comfortable with, or it's something that you're not really 100% sure how to do, it wouldn't hurt to partner with a processor at the beginning. Find a relationship with somebody that you find mutually beneficial, that you can learn from. And then after you've done that for a little while and you feel more comfortable, take that on. I'm really worried about people rushing into the process now and thinking, oh yeah, no, I don't have to, lean on anybody to sell to the customer. There are a lot of things you have to pay attention with when you sell directly to a customer. And just remind yourself, you're taking on all of that risk now. There's nobody else to run to if you have a problem with your product. It's coming directly back to you, and it's under your name only, as also a ding to your reputation if it's for something like potency or mold or another issue.
Paul, as a micro license holder who now has some of these pieces in place, can you talk, and yet it sounds like you've continued to work through some third-party distributors for like Shelter, as well as I think you're probably going through joint ventures, BC Black now. Can you talk a little bit about that decision-making process? Even though you've got those pieces in place, you're still sort of taking the approach that Atia is referring to here.
Sorry, can you clarify what you're asking me?
Well, Atia is talking about how, the sort of cost benefit analysis, I suppose, of once you have the processing license and the sales licenses in place, taking that on yourself and dealing directly with the provinces, as opposed to continuing. I know there are a lot of micros in that position who, even once they have those licenses in place, they continue to work with a third-party processor. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the decision-making process at Organocraft, and why you guys have taken that approach.
Well, we've kind of had a bit of a three-step process as we worked with Shelter, and worked with their quality assurance team as a route to market. They basically did everything for us. We then stepped away from Shelter and joined up with joint venture Craft, and now I'm doing about 75 to 80% of things. And I mean, there's definitely more risk. I mean, to Tia's point about labeling is one of the most difficult parts of the whole packaging process, ensuring that not only are your values correct on there, but even just sizing. I had a question asked me yesterday why we don't put our cultivar name bigger on a label, things like that. Like just making sure that your font sizing and everything is there. I mean, to assume that a young micro that doesn't have a lot of experience can handle all of those different aspects is it's almost crazy to think about. You need a team, and that's where working with the right processor and having the right processor's team behind you, and also educating you along the way is extremely important. I mean, for us, the decision to break out on our own was it's long term, obviously, and even though we've obtained our sales license, we're still working with joint venture Craft Cannabis, and we still will be for a little while yet, until we feel like we are able to go out on our own and effectively manage all of the points that Atia brought up, especially when it comes to recalls and remediation, some of the business decisions, etc.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and outside of the scope of QA a little bit, but I think a lot of smaller producers, not even necessarily just micro, but smaller producers, are finding that even with all these pieces in place and even willing to take on that risk, that oftentimes the provinces really aren't interested in dealing with smaller producers. And so that's another factor to consider, I think. Nina, you have your hand up. You look like you have something you wanted to add there. You're still muted, Nina.
Unmute. I know. Hold on. Okay. So I wanted to comment on the testing as well and the remediation, because one of the things that we keep seeing over and over again here at Freedom is bad quality cannabis coming in with clean COAs. So when I say bad quality, there is visible mold, which has been irradiated, but then the product is still clean. So what I realize and want to advise the micro cultivators and the craft growers and even the standard cultivators is to have good sanitation practices in place, because you cannot irradiate bad products and get rid of the filaments that are created by the mold. they will die, but then consumers will see it and they are going to get upset about it. Some are going to react to the filament because it's a physical contaminant. This is something that is very difficult for the craft growers to understand, but they have to understand it that you cannot irradiate bad product to make it good. Irradiation should not be because we failed, but it should be because we want to extend the shelf life or we want to give better stability to the product, not because the product failed microbial test. Because when the mold filaments are there, irradiation is not going to get rid of it. I just wanted to have that out there.
Thanks, Nina. And I think Tia has a point.
Yeah, that's a really good point with respect to irradiation. So I've had that happen where people irradiate their product and they're like, well, I can still see the mold. And I'm like, yeah, radiation doesn't get rid of any of the mold, like the visible mold. It is like safe. It doesn't have like the same level of activity any longer, but it's still there. So it shouldn't be used. If you have a batch that like looks molded over, there's no point in even irradiating it because nobody is going to take that. So again, starting off really early is really beneficial to do so, but it is great for micro. I know I saw a quick question in the chat about just using extraction essentially. And when I first started in cannabis, that was kind of like, everyone was like, oh, we'll just put it in CO2 extraction. So if your product wasn't hitting on micro or it had mold or anything else, it was kind of like a dumping ground for product. We're like, oh, we'll just toss it into extraction. And then up until 2020, that's when I started to see people who were extractors providing us with specifications. They wouldn't take things over a certain amount anyways. And there was certain types of pathogens that aren't coming out in extraction as well. I know Pseudomonas was a problem for some people. They have Pseudomonas specs. I think that's for ethanol extraction. Maybe I'm a little foggy. It's been a while since I sold to an extractor, but there really isn't any replacement for just growing good quality product. You can't just irradiate vomit. You can't just toss it into extraction. You need to start from the very beginning and set up your processes correctly. Really, irradiation is done even by a lot of larger LPs for exactly what Nina said. Sometimes our batches aren't over. We used to do it as just like a standard practice because we had batches of thousands of kilos and we wanted to make sure that if there's already bacteria inside of there and for some reason your moisture is not 100% on point or your water activity is not where it needs to be, don't get me started on moisture analysis versus water activity. That's a whole other webinar. But there's always a chance that it's going to continue to grow. So maybe if you're intolerance right off the bat and then it's sitting in the vault for a while, there's a chance that you're going to start to creep up in those numbers. So a lot of larger LPs just like wipe the whole thing down so that it can extend the shelf life. So if they have to go for longer term storage and somebody else ends up testing the product down the line, they're still within specification. But really fantastic point by Nina. Garbage in is garbage out, basically. So it shouldn't be that we'll just rely on irradiation to fix the problem. You need to start off in cultivation.
Thanks, Tia. And Paul, looks like you have a point there.
Just the importance from the cultivation side of things about environmental monitoring and getting those specs down, right off the bat. And this kind of comes back to Tia's point about micro cultivators and not having any QA influence at all, or third-party consultants, but to understand how important the environmental monitoring is throughout the entire cultivation process, let alone the processing, let alone the storage. But, to start with that, growing a good, clean product, you have to have your environment dialed. And I don't know if every micro out there has the facility built to be able to handle that when they're actually in cultivation.
Thanks, Paul. And I just have one more question for Leslie. It's a great segue onto that, and then we will jump into the QA. It looks like people have a lot of questions. So Leslie, I wanted to ask you, can you speak to irradiation or remediation? Is that something that Indiva requires of anyone that they're purchasing from, or is it case-by-case basis?
No, we don't require it, but we do require clean cannabis. So we will irradiate it if that's the requirement, and there may be contract negotiations that take part ahead of that decision because it is a very expensive process. It's very time consuming because you need to have a license, a security cleared person accompany that load. It's a very daunting. It's not something we like to do at all. It increases your testing costs because you need before and after tests, and it really is, you know, a last option. But and you also have to be concerned you will see another drop in potency. So we know that it will drop some in potency. So it's really grow it clean is your best best way to go, and it works for all of us, because it's not a we don't like to see when our results show us micro fail, because it gives us a little doubt and we might not want to work with that grower again, because it is a big pain to manage.
Great, thanks. Okay, well, I appreciate all of that information, and we have a lot of questions in the QA. I suspect we're going to go a little past the top of the hour. I hope that's okay with everyone, but I'm just going to jump right in. Thanks to Velvet, who's been compiling these from the chat and the QA. So our first question in the Q&A comes from Jocelyn Hip. What is the stance of the panel regarding spread plate testing for micro versus PCR? So anyone, feel free to just kind of jump in if you've got an answer for that.
We don't,
For me.
yeah, we won't accept PCR testing for micro.
And I do understand why Leslie wouldn't, because for example, for PCR, the real-time PCR, the limit of quantification for salmonella is 28 CFU per gram or so. But per Health Canada requirements and based on the pharmacopoeia, the selected pharmacopoeia, it should be absent in 25 grams. So if the limit of quantification is 28 CFU per gram or so, it makes it very difficult to determine whether that absent in 25 gram specification has been met. But with the plating, the culture plate, it's very easy to determine which microbes are viable and what the actual count is as against the PCR. So I do agree with Leslie there.
Yeah, Tia, feel free to just jump in.
Someone mentioned it in the chat briefly, but yeah, I'm definitely pro plating. I always recommend people use plating when they ask me, they're looking through labs, what should they do? Plating. Also because a lot of my clients are in Europe, and I believe right now for EU GMP, it's only plating allowed. I don't think RT-qPCR is accepted. So for my European clients, there's not really an option. But somebody did mention, and I will give RT-qPCR that if you're looking for identification, so maybe you've done your plating already and you have like a really high TPC and you want to get into the nitty gritty for identification, not for your C of A, not for handing off to the next person, but maybe you're just trying to do a bit of an environmental monitoring and figure out like what the issue is. qPCR is good for identification, but yeah, I don't think it should be used as your predominant method, in my opinion, for doing your C of A's. And yeah, Leslie mentioned that's a classic example, right? Check with your processor if you're working with a processor on what they'll take. You could waste a lot of money on testing product and then hand it over to the processor and they say, great, retest all of this, we can't take any of it. So definitely check what their requirements are too.
Okay, our next question is from an anonymous attendee. Could you recommend which pharmacopoeia would be best, would work best for topicals?
Okay, so if to jump in here, the pharmacopoeia that will work best for topicals could either be USP or the EP. So the licensed producer is responsible for determining what specification they want to use, because for USP and for EP, there are slight variations in the specifications that have been established. So I would encourage the person asking the question to go to these two pharmacopoeia, check what the specs are for the topicals, and determine which one will best suit their company goals.
So another anonymous attendee asks, as a president for a microprocessing license, could I be QA on site? I've heard this is not something possible and I wanted a confirmation. And I can maybe step in here. I mean, there's not necessarily very specific requirements for QAP, but you do need, a certain professional or educational background. So if you're able to take on that role, you can certainly wear multiple hats at a micro license, but in terms of holding the QAP position, you will have to adhere to certain requirements. And actually, I think that's a good segue maybe to Paul. This is something I hear people often asking, here's my work experience. I don't have this education background, but I do have this work experience. Do you think I could become a QAP? And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about your experience, because like you said, you were leaning on your experience in the food production world prior to coming into the cannabis space. So if you could just expand on that a little bit.
Sure. So I started and built a fresh and frozen takeout food business. It's kind of I ran that for about 12 or 13 years. We had multiple locations. We had to follow a variety of standard operating procedures, not at quite the same regulatory level, but I had to, obviously know a lot about food and food safety and food packaging and food labeling. I don't have any formal education in that. I took that experience and experience from the legacy cannabis industry, kind of ported that into learning about licensing and the regulatory requirements for cannabis. I spent a couple of years working with a consulting agency, designing and designing facilities and license acquisition, and then took that experience, combined it with experience here at Organocraft, and managed to get my QAP designation from that. I don't have a science degree. I don't have a major science background. I actually have a degree in business. But with all of that knowledge combined with the experience, that was enough for Health Canada to give me my designation.
Thanks, Paul.
I think that's a good point that Paul brought up. So I teach quality assurance courses, and I have lots of students that have no background. And I firmly believe like the quality assurance guidance that you need for cannabis can be learned. You don't have to have like a degree in science or like some kind of special education. It'd be really beneficial if you're starting up to get a consultant or someone else who can work with you to walk through it. But you don't have to have like pharmaceutical grade knowledge in quality assurance. Cannabis is kind of closer to food on the quality assurance side of things and the level that you need. And I 100% think that everything that you would need to know is trainable. It's just a matter of either taking a program. There's quite a few now in Canada that are specific for cannabis quality assurance. That would be very beneficial to give you a good baseline. And then of course, if you're starting up a micro and you need some help, it's totally fine to reach out to a consultant for the first few months to get you going. To develop some of those more difficult programs or having a science background could be very beneficial, like your sanitation, cleaning validation, stuff like that. And then you're basically on your way after that.
And to add on to what Atia just mentioned, having a science background is actually a plus, especially when it comes to investigating, addressing root causes and trying to pin all the scientific basis for what is happening. So day-to-day quality assurance, you really don't need a science background because it's black and white, but the science background comes in handy when you are doing some investigation. So it would be good to partner or have a science buddy who can also help to understand why things are happening, to resolve those things that are happening.
That's a great point. And I, in the early days in MMPR and ACMPR, that was a very common approach that a lot of the licensed producers were taking the time of sort of marrying up someone with a lot of legacy experience with cannabis with someone with a hard science background to sort of translate a lot of these issues to each other, because both, sort of combining two people into the ultimate QAP. So our next question comes from Anthony Kerrigan and asks what the thoughts are on remediating microbes through extraction. Oh, okay, looks like we've addressed this. What is the point of no return when it comes to producing a clean extract from flower that is high in microbes? So I know we've kind of touched on this, but any additional points from our panelists? I'm getting a no. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question from Luke Roberts. One thing I always wonder about, is there any call for error reporting? I know it's hard for consumers to deal with it, but it always bugged me, and no one reported standard deviation or something similar. And as a follow-up clarification, I mean, you can homogenize all you want, but at the end of the day, you have instrument error at the very least, assuming no sample bias. I just assume some producers, processors would want an example. Any thoughts there from our panel?
I think that like when I talk to people about producing cannabis and the way that Canada has approached it in particular is that they want you to produce it like Tylenol. They want to have batch consistency. They want to have these things, which makes sense because if you're buying a product, you want it to be consistent, but obviously it is a active plant. So as a plant scientist, I am very well aware of the plant to plant differentiation. There's almost no chance you're always going to produce the same product every time. Within a single batch, let's say you have 1 million buds, you have technically 1 million potencies basically on a per bud basis. So I've always believed that I'm not a huge fan, to be honest, of how we test cannabis right now and the tolerances and the ranges that they ask for you, especially like I have a lot of clients that are greenhouse, summer grow versus winter grow of the same variety. And like, even though it's a bit of a controlled environment, like, agriculture, there is a bit of a differentiation there. So yeah, I would agree that if Health Canada wanted to move in the direction of adding a little bit more variability into that, I would be okay with it. But so far, I haven't seen anything along the lines of, okay, well, this is your result plus or minus a certain percentage. To my understanding, you have your result, you build your tolerance ranges that you provide to the OCS or the distribution center of like what you think the product is going to fall in. And then on each batch of product, you have the potency of that C of A written on there. So there is a bit of variation in that sense. If I buy online strictly, I don't get to see the exact potency of the product. I get a range of 17 to 22, and I will get something in that range. So there is a little bit of that built into the product listing, but not with the respect on the interpretation of test results.
Thanks, Atia. So Sean Samuel asks, should LPs move towards GMP production standards? I feel like Atia will want to jump on this one.
I feel like Sean asked that question for me. Sean, I know we have to set up a catch-up call. I'm well aware. Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
Yes. Yeah. Sean's like, I asked that question for you. So yeah, in my opinion, it depends on the market that you want to go into. My clients, many of them are European. It is a requirement for them to sell to other European countries that they're GMP. I've worked with Canadian LPs that are GMP. There are very few that are EU GMP compliant, which means that in markets in Europe that open up that require that, there's only a handful in Canada that can sell into those markets. If you have no intention of selling outside of Canada, or you're a micro in particular, which is what most of this people of the webinar are for, you may not really want to deal with the logistics and the hassle. I just had to ship clones from Canada into Switzerland, and that was like the most stressful 6 weeks of my life, just figuring out how to move it between the regulations. There's still a lot of barriers there. So it is expensive. If you are not already built to EU GMP, getting the team, getting even a consultant to do EU GMP for you is quite costly. Making sure that everything is set up correctly, going through all the validation for all the equipment. It's an investment that I don't really see a lot of micros, or personally haven't seen any micros going for. If you're really gunning to get into Europe, Australia, certain other markets that are like ramping up to ask for these requirements, then yes, I would recommend it. Within Canada, I personally don't see there being a benefit to spending that much money to sell down the street. I just don't see it being really worthwhile, even though I love GMP and I love, throw more quality on it. I'm all for that, but I definitely wouldn't bother with it if you're not going to sell into Europe.
It looks like I see everyone else nodding there. So from another question in the chat, what percentage of drop in potency is generally or usually noticed when a batch undergoes irradiation?
I can say from our experience, we usually see an average around 2%, but it's not regular. It's kind of between 1 and 3, but on average 2, I would say.
And are you seeing a change in moisture levels?
No, not consistently.
Interesting. Okay, I think we have a couple more questions here. Give me a moment.
Leslie, can I ask you a quick question for irradiation? Have you seen a drop in terpenes? Because we were seeing that as well, but I just don't know if it's gotten any better. Or we were seeing, for us, the terpene drop was a little bit higher just because of the comparative. It's only like 2% anyways. The percentage drop was always higher in the terpenes and the potency.
Yeah, I would say not consistently. It's still a bit of a mystery on the terps.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Well,
it's not something we want to do. Oh, sorry. It's not something we want to do a lot of research into because we don't want to irradiate.
So someone else in the chat asks about irradiation and alternatives to irradiation other than, growing well enough to not require. And I'm assuming they mean specifically irradiation as opposed to the general topic of remediation. So Leslie or anyone else, can you talk about some of those other options?
We've looked into the E-beam, but it's so far away from us here in Southern Ontario. It's not remotely an option. So that's we're really reliant on irradiation.
I've spent a
Yeah,
lot
that's
of
a good.
time. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Atia.
I've spent a lot of time checking into other remediation methods because that's not allowed in Europe. So we did e-beaming at the first place that I worked, and we used to call it the employee of the month because someone had to fly with it from Ontario to BC back in the day. So someone had to fly into Iotron, I think it's called, every single month with the batch, which was like annoying because you would just fly there, stay there for a few hours and fly back. So the other options I've looked into is ozonation, which some places don't accept because it can be listed as an additive on the product. So California, for example, if you ozonate your product, it has to list ozone on the actual dried cannabis and ozone on the back. Some people also ozonate throughout other parts of the process in cultivation. In dry, I've seen quite a bit. People will ozone bomb their dried product. There's electromagnetic radio frequency, which hyper oscillates water molecules at a molecular level and creates pockets of heat. That technology is not a service. You would have to purchase the machines, keep them in-house. So it's quite a large capital expenditure. I think you're looking at $200,000 US per unit. And then there's also another technology which basically is kind of like electromagnetic, but it's a different radio frequency. So all of the newer ones that I'm seeing are radio frequency bases. They're different parts or they're microwaves. They're all different wavelengths, but none of them are really service offerings. The only service offerings are e-beaming and irradiation. So for all of the other ones, you're looking at a significant capital expenditure. Again, not an option I see for a microcultivator, probably a minimum spend of $70,000 for a decent set of equipment. So it's quite a big expense.
Any
To
thoughts
add
on?
on to that,
Yeah,
sorry,
please go.
sorry, David. Yeah, to add on to that, I know we've talked about hygiene and sanitation, but we can't emphasize it enough. So having control over your processes, having control over your drying, your curing, your storage, everything really helps, because I know LPs that do not irradiate because they have put in place the basic necessities throughout the lifespan of the plant to the final product. So it can be done. We just have to make sure that we have the right sanitation processes in place. We have the right processes when it comes to drying, to curing in place. And then, yeah, we wouldn't need to irradiate all the time.
And any thoughts from the panel on, I've talked to some micros who say they've found success washing their cannabis with like a hydrogen solution. Any thoughts on that process?
Washing the cannabis with hydrogen.
Hydrogen peroxide.
Yeah, a foliar spray. As if it's only approved by Health Canada, it can be used. So before anybody uses any foliar spray, they should go to the Health Canada webpage to make sure that the chemical that they are going to use is approved under Health Canada's requirements.
I've personally never heard of that, and I don't back that as a recommendation. I would not recommend that people do that. I think there's a lot of risk if you don't apply it correctly, and it can damage the plants. Yes, hydrogen peroxide breaks down to water later on, which is why I use it for flushing drippers before I'm about to do in between grows. But direct spraying on plants, number one, yeah, I don't even know if that's allowed. And number two, I just think, let's just get back to, it's not that hard to grow, especially at a micro level where you're only 200 square meters. You're not, my last company that I worked at full time, 36,000 plant harvest. That's hard to grow consistently clean. There's just too much stuff. When you're growing 200 meters squared, I've actually seen a ton of micros that have completely within specification like product. I don't actually think it's a huge problem for micros to be out of specification. If you have a good sanitation program, you're typically not running as dense as a greenhouse operator who's like 1 million square feet, right? So I think like Nina is just right. We got to nail that on the head. We can discuss radiation options, and I'm glad everyone has questions about it, but your main goal should be, how do I avoid having to ever use one ever? And then this is my absolute maybe one off batch for the year, have to irradiate it. That should really be a backup plan, not your main course of action.
Yeah, really, I totally agree. And concentrate on the basics. It can be something as simple as proper PPE throughout your facility and not getting lax on all those sanitation basics. Rather than trying to think of an end solution, follow preventive controls and really understand what can have an impact on your end product during the growth cycle.
Complacency is a killer. You got to stay on top of all of it.
So this isn't really a QA question, but I think it's an interesting one nonetheless. Is someone asks, what strategies do you use to minimize the cost of tests of testing when dealing with small lots?
Okay, so to come in here, as I mentioned in my introduction, the timing of testing is very important. For small batches, we know that pesticides have to be tested before processing. So I would encourage everyone to test the dried cannabis or the fresh cannabis right after harvest for pesticides. And then after processing in the final form, after the last processing step, all other tests can be performed. You don't necessarily, so if the product is being sold as a whole big batch, there's only one set of testing that has to be done. But if it's being split into different lots under the same conditions, only one testing has to be done. But if it's being split and being processed into different products, then we have to obviously test for all the different products that the product is going to be turned into. Without testing for pesticides, because the pesticide is a blanket test that covers the whole batch. I think that saves LPs a lot of money when it comes to testing, because pesticide, I know, is the most expensive component of testing. And you only need one for a crop of plants. You don't need 2, 3 for every batch you make from that crop of plants.
Thanks, Nina. So I believe this is the last question from Poonam, and the QA asks, when retesting after treatment, does the product require full panel test or just the initial test?
From my personal experience with Health Canada, I know most of the LPs are not doing the full test and they're only doing the microbial retest. Because obviously it's the microorganisms that are targeted during treatment. Health Canada considers treatment or irradiation as a processing step. So apart from pesticides, they expect full test on the product after irradiation. The only way they would accept only microbial retest is when there is validated data. There's data that validates the testing, not affecting heavy metals, not affecting potency, not affecting terpenes or any other parameter in the test panel, which for me really doesn't make sense because heavy metals are not affected pre or post irradiation. But Health Canada expects the full panel to be done, except pesticides.
And there's one other question, and I can actually respond to it myself, but feel free to jump in, anyone else. But Sarah asks, can someone comment on what Health Canada considers canopy space for the 200 square meters? Is it table measurements and clone trays? The answer is it's your canopy. So you need to be basing your measurements on enclosing the entire cannabis plant within those 200 square meters. And so you'll need to plan, when you're putting a clone in, you'll need to have, the space for that to grow out and still be within those 200 square meters. If anyone has any corrections or anything and they want to jump in there, feel free. And I believe, Velvet, is that, I think we've gone through all the questions. Are there any additional points that any of our panelists want to provide before we go? Don't everyone jump up at once.
That looks like it. I think we've covered all the questions. And Anurag just added a link to a Google Doc where people can add questions.
Great, thanks.
Later on, we can get to.
Great, thanks. And and as I said, this has been recorded. We will be posting it on the C45 YouTube channel in about a week. So if there's any points that you missed and you're hoping to go back and reference or share with anyone else, this will be live on the site. I really want to thank our panelists for taking so much time out of their day, as well as the time to prepare for this beforehand. I think this was a very interesting talk. I hope all of our panelists and attendees found it interesting. And we are hoping to do more micro QA panels like this through C45 in the coming months, and providing more access to quality assurance professionals for the micro community to really help them better understand these issues. So feel free to reach out to C45 if you have any thoughts on how we can put together some more informative panels, some of the issues that micro and other craft license holders are running into. And please be aware of C45's membership and the sort of opportunities that panels like this can provide by being connected with the QA community. The C45 membership, I believe they have over around 100 QAPs and labs who are members now, who by being a member of the organization, you can have access to. So again, I just want to thank everyone. Thanks to Velvet, thanks to Anuraga for putting this together. Thanks to our panelists, thanks to C45 and the C45 board as well, of all our members. And we will see you all again very soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Very much.
All right, well, I think that went pretty well.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to hit end and stop recording.